What would you do if God delayed your miracle while your child was dying? Jairus had no time for riddles or parables. His 12-year-old daughter, the light of his home, lay at the edge of death. Her breathing was shallow, her skin pale, and each minute seemed to drag her closer to the grave. Every fatherly instinct screamed at him to save her, but the truth haunted him. There was nothing he could do. Wealth could not buy life. Knowledge could not extend her days. His position as a synagogue ruler could not keep death away from his doorstep. So Jairus did the unthinkable. He left his dying daughter's bedside, not to call a doctor, not to gather relatives, but to find one man, Jesus of Nazareth. The streets of Capernaum swirled with people. Dust rose with the heat of the sun as vendors shouted and children played. Yet in Jairus' heart there was only storm. His robe dragged in the dirt as he ran, his eyes wild with desperation. This was no dignified walk of a leader. This was a father's sprint against time. He had heard of Jesus, how lepers were cleansed, how the lame leapt, how demons fled at his voice. But the question that burned in Jairus' soul was not, can he, but will he before it is too late? When he finally reached the crowd, he saw him. Jesus stood in the center, surrounded by pressing bodies, people crying out for his touch, his word, his miracle. Jairus' heart pounded. He pushed past fishermen, beggars, and mothers with infants. Dignity had no place here. Then in front of everyone, this leader of the synagogue fell to his knees before the carpenter. Gasps filled the air. A man of such honor bowing in the dust. But Jairus had no shame left. His voice cracked with desperation. My little daughter is dying. Please come and lay your hands on her that she may be healed and live. The crowd hushed. His words hung in the air. The synagogue ruler, known for teaching the law, known for guarding tradition, was now begging at the feet of the very man many accused of blasphemy. And then Jesus looked at him. There was no hesitation, no rebuke. His eyes, filled with compassion, met the father's trembling plea, and he said nothing. He simply began to walk with him. Jairus teaches us the first step of faith is humility. Sometimes God brings us to places where our titles, money, and strength mean nothing. In those moments, the only thing left to do is fall at the feet of Jesus. True faith often begins where pride ends. The streets of Capernaum were alive with noise. Merchants called out their wares. Fishermen carried their nets, and children darted between stalls. But today, the air carried something different, a charged expectancy, a sense that heaven itself had touched earth. Jesus was there. Word had spread like wildfire. Some whispered, he is the prophet Moses spoke of. Others argued, no, he breaks the Sabbath, how can he be from God? But no one could deny the power in his words or the miracles in his hands. As Jairus clung to Jesus, desperate for him to hurry, the crowd swelled. They pressed in from every side. Rough hands brushed his shoulders, needy fingers tugged at his robe, voices shouted above one another, Rabbi, heal me! Jesus, look at my son. Teacher, speak to me. The dust thickened in the air as sandals shuffled closer and closer, the crush of humanity surrounding the healer. For Jairus, each second was a blade cutting deeper into his hope. Every delay felt like a nail sealing his daughter's coffin. He wanted to cry out, move aside. Do you not see my little girl is dying? But the words caught in his throat. How could he demand priority when so many others also suffered? Sweat dripped down his temple. His chest heaved with both urgency and fear. He thought of his wife back home, sitting by their daughter's bed, listening to her fading breaths. Every image tore him apart, yet Jesus did not seem rushed. His steps were steady, his face calm, as though eternity itself walked within him. Jairus felt the torment of time, but Jesus carried the peace of timelessness. The closer they moved, the tighter the press became. It was as if the world itself leaned upon this one man, desperate to draw something from him. And Jairus, with every step, felt both relief and agony. Relief because Jesus was coming. Agony because what if they were too late? Jairus was not just another man in the crowd. He was a ruler of the synagogue, a man of authority, dignity, and religious honor. People normally stood when he entered. They listened when he spoke. His robe marked his status. His voice carried weight, but today none of that mattered. As soon as he reached Jesus, Jairus collapsed to his knees in the dirt. The crowd gasped. A leader of the synagogue, bowing to this controversial teacher from Nazareth. For many it was unthinkable. For Jairus it was survival. His voice broke as he cried out, "My little daughter is at the point of death. I beg you, come and lay your hands on her so she may be healed and live." The crowd fell into silence. No one had ever seen Jairus like this, tears streaming down his face, his hands trembling, his pride shattered before them all. The ruler of the synagogue was now a desperate father. Whispers darted through the crowd. "Isn't this Jairus, the leader of the synagogue? Look at him pleading at his feet. Doesn't he know what this will cost him with the other leaders?" But Jairus no longer cared about reputation. His daughter's life outweighed his honor. His heart pounded as he waited for Jesus' reply. Then it happened. Jesus' eyes met his calm, steady, full of compassion. He did not hesitate. He did not question Jairus' motives. He simply turned and began to follow him. The ruler who once commanded others now found himself clinging to the steps of a humble carpenter. Pride had fallen. Desperation had won. And in that brokenness, faith had been born. The moment Jesus turned to follow Jairus, something shifted. The crowd, restless and noisy a moment ago, now swarmed with new energy. All eyes fixed on this desperate father and the teacher who had agreed to go with him. Jairus rose from his knees, his heart pounding with both relief and urgency. At last Jesus was coming. The healer was walking toward his house. His daughter still had a chance. The streets seemed longer than usual, winding like rivers clogged with people. Every step felt like an eternity. Jairus glanced at Jesus constantly, almost afraid he would change his mind, afraid he would turn aside. Yet Jesus' stride was calm, unhurried, steady as though he carried time itself in his hands. Jairus tried to push the crowd aside. "Make way! Please, make way!" Every few moments, Jairus' mind betrayed him. He saw flashes of his daughter's pale face. What if he returned too late? Fear clawed at his faith, but then he would look at Jesus. The calm on his face, the authority in his presence, the compassion in his eyes. Something in Jairus' trembling heart whispered, "If he is with me, there is still hope." The journey became more than a walk to his home. It was a test of patience, of trust, of faith when time seemed too short. And though Jairus could not yet see it, this walk was leading him into one of the greatest revelations of his life, that sometimes God allows the delay, not to destroy hope, but to display his glory. Jairus' journey with Jesus teaches us that faith is not just about receiving the miracle, it's about walking with him through the waiting. God's timing is never rushed, even when our hearts are breaking. The streets were narrow, the air heavy with dust, and Jairus could almost feel the seconds slipping away like grains of sand through his fingers. He clung to hope with every step, just a little further, just a little longer. But then it happened. Jesus stopped. The sudden halt jolted Jairus like a blow. His heart lurched. "Why are we stopping?" he thought, panic rising in his chest. He turned to see what had interrupted them. In the middle of the pressing crowd, a frail woman had touched the edge of Jesus' robe. For 12 years she had been bleeding, unclean, outcast from worship and society. She had suffered under many physicians, spending all she had, and grew worse instead of better. Quietly, desperately, she had reached out not with her hand alone, but with faith burning in her soul. Jesus turned slowly, his voice steady but piercing. "Who touched my clothes?" The crowd fell silent, then erupted with confusion. His disciples were baffled. Peter gestured at the massive bodies pressing around him and said, "Master, the crowd is thronging you, and you ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus knew his power had gone out. Healing had flowed. He would not move until the one who touched him by faith revealed herself. The woman, trembling, fell before him. With tears streaming, she confessed everything: the years of suffering, the shame, the rejection, the endless nights of pain, and how with one touch she was made whole. Jesus lifted her face with gentle eyes. "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction," the crowd marveled. Some gasped, others whispered praises, but Jairus stood frozen. His heart pounded in agony. Every word Jesus spoke to her felt like another second stolen from his daughter's life. Rage and despair warred within him. He wanted to rejoice for this woman, but his mind screamed, "Why now? Couldn't this wait? My daughter is dying." Faith collided with fear in that moment. Jairus' miracle was slipping away before his eyes. What Jairus could not yet see was this the same Jesus, who had power to heal a woman of 12 years' suffering, also had authority over the 12 years of his daughter's life. But for Jairus, the delay felt like death itself. The delay was not cruelty, it was divine purpose. Jesus showed Jairus that his power is not limited by time. Healing a woman on the way was not a distraction, it was a demonstration. The woman's sobs quieted as the crowd marveled. She clung to the words of Jesus, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." For 12 long years, she had been nameless, defined only by her suffering. But in one moment, Jesus gave her both healing and identity. She was no longer the bleeding woman, she was daughter. The people cheered, some wept openly. Others pressed closer, hoping for their own miracle. The air was charged with awe, but not Jairus. He stood rigid, his eyes darting back and forth between Jesus and the road to his house. His mind was a battlefield of emotions. Yes, he saw the miracle. Yes, he knew this was divine power. But beneath the wonder, a knife twisted in his soul. Every word Jesus spoke to her felt like time draining from his daughter's life. 12 years the woman had suffered. 12 years his little girl had lived. The parallel cut deep, almost mocking. The crowd rejoiced. Jairus despaired. And in that moment, the lesson of the hidden miracle was taking root. Because what Jairus could not yet see was this: Jesus was not only showing his power to heal, he was preparing Jairus' heart to believe in his power to raise the dead. The delay was not just a pause, it was a prophecy in action. Sometimes God blesses others right before our eyes while we are still waiting. It can feel unfair, even cruel, but hidden in those moments is a message. If he can do it for them, he can do it for you even greater. The crowd was still buzzing from the woman's healing when Jairus heard footsteps pounding the road behind him. He turned and his heart froze. It was one of his household servants. The man's face was pale, his eyes heavy with sorrow. Jairus knew before a word was spoken. The servant grasped his shoulder, voice low but heavy. "Your daughter is dead. Don't trouble the teacher any longer." The words shattered him. They weren't loud, but they were crushing like a whisper from hell itself. The sound rang in Jairus' ears, drowning out the crowd, drowning out even his own heartbeat. His knees weakened, his vision blurred. He could almost hear his wife's cries from afar, though she was miles away. His daughter, his only child, his joy, his little girl was gone. Jairus staggered, torn between collapse and fury. A storm raged inside him. If only we had gone faster. If only he hadn't stopped for that woman. If only I had come sooner. But before Jairus could speak, Jesus turned to him. His gaze pierced through the storm of despair, steady and unshaken. And with authority, he said the words that cut through the whisper of doubt: "Do not fear. Only believe." The command was simple, but it shook the atmosphere. Fear screamed louder than faith in Jairus' heart. But Jesus was calling him beyond sight, beyond reason, beyond death itself into the realm of resurrection. Do not fear. Could it really be that simple? Fear was choking him, pressing on his chest like iron chains. Fear was telling him to collapse, to give up, to accept the finality of death. Only believe. Believe in what? That a healer could still help when his child was already gone. Believe that Jesus was more than a prophet, more than a teacher. Believe that he had authority even over death itself. It was too much for his mind to grasp, but something deep in his spirit stirred. Jesus wasn't just comforting him, he was commanding faith to rise above despair. For Jairus, the choice was clear: drown in fear or cling to faith. His lips trembled, his heart wavered, but he chose to walk. He chose to keep leading Jesus to his house, even if hope seemed buried. and as he walked, those words burned in his soul like fire. Do not fear, only believe. Jesus' voice is stronger than the whispers of despair. Faith does not always silence fear immediately, but it teaches us to walk forward despite it. The voice of resurrection is not just for Jairus, it is for every believer facing a hopeless situation. The crowd that had pressed so tightly around them began to thin. Jesus stopped the multitude from following and chose only 3 disciples, Peter, James, and John, to continue with him. The rest were dismissed. Jairus glanced at Jesus with confusion. Why only these 3? But something in Jesus' eyes silenced his questions. He was teaching Jairus that not everyone can walk with you into the place of deepest faith. Some must be left behind because doubt and mockery cannot coexist with resurrection power. As they walked, the silence grew thick. Jairus' thoughts screamed louder than the sounds of the city. He pictured his wife weeping by their daughter's lifeless body. He imagined the cold stillness of her hands. He felt the shame of returning home with a healer who had arrived too late. But then Jesus' words returned to him, whispering in his spirit, "Do not fear, only believe." With each step, he was learning something profound. Faith is not the absence of fear, it is the decision to keep walking with Jesus, even when fear is screaming. Sometimes faith feels less like a shout of victory and more like a trembling step forward. Jairus' walk shows us that miracles are not always found in sudden breakthroughs, but in the courage to keep moving with Jesus when everything inside you says to stop. At last, the familiar outline of Jairus' house came into view, but instead of relief, dread gripped his chest. The sounds reached him before the sight did: wailing voices, mournful cries, the piercing notes of flutes echoing in sorrow. It was the sound of death. Jairus froze. His worst fears were confirmed. This was no longer the home he had left in hope. It had become a house of mourning. As he drew closer, he saw neighbors gathered outside, their faces drawn in pity. Some shook their heads, whispering among themselves, "Too late, if only he had brought the teacher sooner." Others avoided his eyes altogether. Inside, professional mourners cried aloud, their voices sharp and hollow. Women tore their garments. The air was thick with grief. His wife knelt by their daughter's still body, her sobs breaking the heart of anyone who heard them. Jairus staggered at the threshold. His knees threatened to give way. His little girl, his joy, his laughter, his pride was gone. She lay motionless, pale, silent. No flicker of breath, no spark of life. But then, amid the chaos, Jesus stepped forward. His presence seemed to cut through the noise, the flutes, the weeping. He surveyed the scene, his eyes steady, his spirit unshaken, and with a voice that silenced the room, he said, "Why are you making such commotion and weeping? The child is not dead but sleeping." Gasps filled the house. Some stopped crying, staring at him in shock. Others frowned, offended by his words. A few muttered under their breath, "Sleeping. Does he not see her body? She is gone." But Jesus was not speaking with human sight. He was speaking with divine authority. The room fell into uneasy silence after Jesus' words. The child is not dead, but sleeping. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Jairus' wife lifted her tear-stained face, hope flickering, fragile as a candle in the wind. Could it be true? Could her daughter truly be only sleeping? But then the silence broke. It began with a scoff, then a chuckle, then a ripple of laughter spread across the mourners like fire across dry straw. Soon the house shook with derision. "Sleeping? Does he not see the body? What foolishness! This is no prophet, this is madness." The sound of laughter was cruel, cutting deeper than grief. It mocked not just Jesus, but Jairus' fragile hope. It was the laughter of unbelief, the sneer of a world convinced that death always has the last word. But Jesus did not flinch. His eyes blazed with authority. He turned to the crowd of mourners, and with holy indignation he drove them out. Their mockery had no place where resurrection would step in. Only Jairus, his wife, and 3 disciples were permitted to stay. The doors closed. The noise of laughter and wailing faded outside. Inside remained only silence, grief, and a fragile thread of faith. What Jairus did not yet realize was this unbelief must always be removed before miracles are revealed. The air was heavy. A single lamp flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. In the center of the room lay the child. Her small body rested on the bed, still and pale, her face peaceful as though in sleep. But the chill of death lingered. Her tiny hand was motionless. Her chest did not rise, but Jesus walked closer, his footsteps steady, his presence commanding. He did not look hurried. He did not look anxious. Where others saw the end, he saw opportunity. And then Jesus drew near to the little girl's bed. He reached out his hand. The room seemed to hold its breath. Jesus did what no rabbi, no priest, no holy man would ever do. He reached out and touched her hand. In that moment, eternity flowed into mortality. Heaven gripped earth. The author of life held the hand of one who had slipped into the silence of death. Then Jesus spoke. His words were not shouted. They were gentle, intimate, like a father waking a beloved child. Talitha, Koum, Aramaic, simple, tender, powerful. It meant, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." The words were like thunder whispered softly, a command wrapped in love, an order clothed in compassion. And as those words filled the room, something unseen shifted. The grip of death began to break. The chains of the grave loosened. Breath once stolen rushed back into her lungs. Her fingers twitched in his grasp. The touch of eternity had reached her. The words still lingered in the room. Talitha, Koum. Little girl, I say to you, arise. At first there was silence. Jairus and his wife leaned in, their eyes locked on their daughter's still form. The disciples stood frozen, holding their breath, waiting. Then it happened, a faint flutter in her eyelids, a tremor in her fingers. Her lips parted ever so slightly and a gasp filled the air. Breath-sweet, unmistakable breath rushed back into her lungs. Her chest began to rise and fall. Color returned to her cheeks. Her small hand gripped Jesus' hand with new strength. Jairus staggered backward, eyes wide with shock. His wife let out a cry that was half scream, half sob, covering her mouth with trembling hands. Peter and James clutched each other, unable to speak, while John's eyes filled with tears of awe. The little girl sat up slowly, blinking as though waking from a long sleep. She looked around the room, confused but alive gloriously, undeniably alive. "Abba?" a small voice croaked. Jairus fell to his knees, sobbing uncontrollably. He gathered her into his arms, holding her so tightly it was as if he would never let go again. His wife pressed against them, her cries mingling with laughter, overwhelmed with joy. The room that had been filled with death now overflowed with life. Silence had given way to gasps, to weeping, to worship, and in the middle of it all, Jesus stood calm and steady. To him, this was no spectacle, it was simply his Father's will. Death had been forced to surrender, and the child had risen. The breath that returned to the little girl was more than oxygen, it was the breath of God, the same Spirit that breathed into Adam at creation. When Jesus speaks, even death itself must obey. The miracle teaches us that no situation is too far gone. When Jesus speaks life, what was dead must rise again. The little girl stood steady on her feet. Her eyes, once glazed in death's shadow, now shone with innocent light. She blinked at the faces around her, confused by their tears and astonished gasps. Jairus trembled, not just from relief, but from reverence. He realized now that Jesus was more than a healer, more than a teacher. He was something greater, something that human words could not contain. His wife clutched the child tightly, whispering prayers of thanks, but her eyes too kept darting toward Jesus. Gratitude was mingled with trembling. How could this man wield such authority over life and death? The little girl looked around innocently, unaware of the storm of emotions in the room. To her, she had simply been awakened from sleep. But to those who witnessed it, this was no ordinary. It was a glimpse of eternity breaking into time. The disciples felt it. The parents felt it. The air itself seemed heavy with holy weight. For when God speaks life, those who witness it cannot remain the same. Her mother quickly fetched bread and figs, her hands trembling as she placed them before her daughter. The little girl smiled faintly and began to eat. With each bite, laughter and tears filled the room again. Life was not only restored, it was sustained. Jairus realized something profound. His faith had been tested beyond limits. He had believed for healing, but Jesus had required him to believe through delay, disappointment, even death itself. Faith was not just trusting God when things looked possible. It was trusting him when hope seemed gone. Jairus learned that day that true faith survives the grave. As Jairus reflected, a detail struck him. His daughter had lived 12 years. The woman healed on the way had suffered 12 years. This was no coincidence. 12 is the number of divine order, 12 tribes of Israel, 12 disciples of Jesus, 12 foundations of God's city. The two miracles were linked by heaven's design. The woman's 12 years of shame ended as the girl's 12 years of life seemed to end. One represented chronic suffering, the other sudden tragedy. Both met Jesus. Both were restored. It was a picture of his kingdom. He is Lord over long-standing pain and over sudden loss. Nothing, no timeline, no circumstances beyond his reach. The miracle was more than compassion for one family. It was a foreshadowing of what was to come. One day soon, another loved one would lie still. Jesus himself would be taken down from a cross, his body lifeless, his followers weeping in despair, and just as he had spoken to the girl, the Father would speak to him. "My son, arise." The resurrection of Jairus' daughter whispered of the greater resurrection, the one that would conquer death for all mankind. Jairus would later hear the news of Jesus' crucifixion, and he would remember the laughter in his home, the mockery when Jesus said, "She is not dead, but sleeping." He realized then that mockery always follows true faith. The crowd laughed at Jesus before the miracle, and they laughed again as he hung on the cross. But just as mockery did not stop him in Jairus' house, it could not stop him at Calvary. God's purposes are never silenced by the scorn of men. Jairus' heart returned often to that agonizing moment, the delay, when Jesus stopped for the bleeding woman. At first, it had felt cruel, but now he understood. If Jesus had healed his daughter before she died, it would have been a miracle. But by delaying, he revealed something greater: resurrection power. What felt like abandonment was actually preparation for a greater glory. The words of Jesus became Jairus' anchor for life. "Do not fear, only believe." Those words carried him through every future trial. Fear would always knock at the door, but faith in the one who had raised his daughter, would always answer. Faith had not removed fear that day, but it had outlived it. Years later, Jairus would still remember the words, the touch, the moment his daughter opened her eyes. But greater still, he would remember the voice. "Little girl, I say to you, arise." That voice still echoes. It is not confined to one room in Capernaum. It calls to every heart, every broken life, every faith that feels dead. Jesus is still whispering to this world, "Arise, arise from despair. Arise from sin. Arise from unbelief. Arise to life eternal," because when Jesus enters the room, death must leave. This story is not only history, it is prophecy for us today. Fear says it's over. Faith says it's just beginning. The one who raised Jairus' daughter is the same one who calls you now. When hope seemed gone, when the crowd mocked, when fear whispered, "It's over," Jesus spoke louder. "Do not fear, only believe." And with one touch, death surrendered. With one command, life returned. Maybe you feel like Jairus right now, surrounded by delays, mocked by doubters, crushed by fear. Or maybe you feel like his daughter, lifeless, forgotten, buried under despair. But hear this, the same voice that said, "Little girl, arise," is calling you today. Arise from fear, arise from sin, arise from hopelessness, arise to life in Christ, because when Jesus enters the room, death must leave. If this story moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Let the message of faith spread. Subscribe to Joint Heirs Bible Stories for more powerful, life-changing stories from Scripture. Like this video to help it reach others who need hope. Comment below with your thoughts. What part of Jairus' story spoke to your heart today? Together, let's build a community hungry for God's word, a family of joint heirs in Christ.